he actually went off at Tamil Nadu political parties saying, do not try to divorce us.
I know.
This is like a husband and wife issue.
That's right.
What do you have to say about Justice Vigneswaran's?
Well, I was a big fan.
Shifting policies.
I endorsed the nomination. I thought it was a brilliant stroke, simply because I was tired of seeing uneducated people moving up in politics. So it was something to be welcomed. But I dare say that if Justice Vigneswaran had been on the bench and he had been listening to candidate Vigneswaran as a lawyer, he would have been very sardonic and said, you're just not making a coherent presentation. It's not a coherent argument, because he's all over the place. Now, the most respected commentator on Tamil politics has been for quite a long time D.B.S. Jayaraj, the journalist. D.B.S. Jayaraj has written a piece on his weblog out of Toronto, which was reproduced, I believe, in the Daily Mirror, in which he's done a devastating expose of the use of coded secessionism in the propaganda of the TNA, the use of LTT or pro-LTT songs as part of the campaign, the invocation of Prabhakaran as a great hero by the Tamil media and Justice Vigneswaran, and he says this is like 1977, we are headed for a disaster. Now, he speculates that this could be because of a tie-up with the more extreme elements of the Tamil diaspora. But certainly, we have a problem. I mean, this is something that has to be taken note of. Now, if I may anticipate, there would be those who say, look, this is why we were opposed to the 13th Amendment. But I think that's specious argumentation, because one can be opposed to...
But don't you also think that, Dr. Jayatilleka, if this sort of... like you said, the secessionism that was mentioned by Jayaraj and by others, do you think that if this continues, the people of the Northern Province will lose their provincial council with the same haste that they were given it?
Well, that's really D.B.S. Jayaraj's last sentence. But I think it's not that simple. Because I think this is part of a larger trap that is being set for the government of Sri Lanka. And knowing the government of Sri Lanka, it's perfectly possible that it will fall into it, or actually run and sort of take a running jump into it. And the trap is to provoke the government of Sri Lanka into a premature dissolution of the council. Now, Jayaraj writes that the aim and objective of the radicals in the Tamil diaspora, who seem to be the driving force now of the TNA's politics, is not to make the 13th Amendment work or to stretch the 13th Amendment. On the contrary, says Jayaraj, it is to prove that the 13th Amendment does not work and cannot work. In other words, now this is me, not Jayaraj, it's a political suicide bomb. That's what this whole project is. You get in there and you detonate it. You're not trying to make this work, to stretch it or to have it fully implemented. What you really want is to wreck it so that the government is provoked into a premature and arrogant dissolution. And that triggers an externally supported secession. Now, the TNA's manifesto, in its last paragraph, says that it believes that peace is possible only under international auspices, not with the help of, or with the support of, or with the constructive engagement of the international community. Under international auspices. So we are really talking about a Kosovo or Southern Sudan. The manifesto, you unpack the manifesto. Apart from what I told you about the tigers, the other significant aspect, dangerous aspect, is the conceptual part of it, because it says, quite rightly, that sovereignty does not reside in the state but in the people. So far, so good. But the next sentence, the very next sentence, substitutes the people with the Tamil people.
This is where another problem arises. I mean, in a democratic society, everyone should have the right to self-determination. In the ideal democratic society, you should have the right to self-determination. But doesn't it depend on where you're arguing for self-determination from?
Absolutely.
If you're arguing for self-determination from a communalist standpoint, should you be given that self-determination?
Exactly. Now, every nation has a right of self-determination. And Sri Lanka, as a nation, has a right to determine its own political destiny. Now, if you shift from that, I agree entirely that sovereignty does not reside in the government or in the state. We are a republic, and as such, sovereignty derives from, and in the final analysis resides in the people. But that's the people taken as a whole. That is the entire citizenry of the country, of Sri Lanka. Now,
regardless of caste, religion, color.
Regardless. Now, this does not mean that power should not be devolved from center to periphery, that there shouldn't be a measure of self-administration or self-rule or even self-government. But that's different from saying that sovereignty can be fragmented along particularist lines, so ethnic or communal lines. Now, the idea that sovereignty is vested in the Tamil people and therefore the Tamil people and the Sinhala people have to share sovereignty is outside not just the Republican Constitution of Sri Lanka, that's one thing, but it's outside most federal systems. There is no shared sovereignty in the United States, which is federal, or Australia. There are many federal systems, and I don't have a problem with federalism as such, but the TNA manifesto attempts very surreptitiously to fix, almost like fixing an explosive device under a car, to fix the idea of sovereignty residing in the Tamil people being a distinct people in whom sovereignty resides, and the idea that the Tamil people have the right of self-determination. Now, it's not qualified. It doesn't say internal self-determination, not that would be unproblematic, but it says the right of self-determination. Now, the right of self-determination is the right to decide your own destiny up to and including the setting up of a politically independent country. So, federalism, I've seen Mr. Sumandran defending the manifesto today and saying, what's wrong with federalism? Well, there's nothing wrong with federalism. But federalism is the car under which this, you've got to creep underneath and look at what's being fixed under that. And that is something that almost no federal system recognizes. India does not recognize the right of self-determination of the constituent states. So this is quite deadly. It is not tantamount to secession or secessionism, but it certainly unlatches a window and leaves it surreptitiously ajar for secessionism. So I think the expectation is that the government will be provoked into dissolution, which will trigger what they call external self-determination.
Now, these are, let's say we're assuming, we're making assumptions regarding the motives or the motivations of the Tamil National Alliance. But there's also a group on this side, on the other side of the line, that have the same motivations with different intentions.
Yes.
Now, a dissolution at the end of the day has to come, when we say the government, it is only the president that can dissolve the provincial council. So, are there persons close to the president who would want to see this transpire for different reasons to the Tamil National Alliance?
Oh, absolutely.
We would love to see that happening.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take the debate in the last 6 months, it's very easy to identify, it's all in the newspapers, the personalities and their locations. Those who are opposed to any kind of devolution, who wanted the 13th Amendment abolished, and who are opposed to holding the election. So yes, there are the Sinhala hawks, some of whom are very well placed indeed. So we're caught between these extremes. The president has taken the risk of having this election, and I would like to think that he would not easily dissolve the council. But I can envisage a nightmarish scenario in which the conduct of the council is so adventurous, so provocative, and the embellishment or magnification of that conduct by the singular hawks is so large that it triggers disaffection in the South, not just on the street, but in the armed forces. Because it is perfectly possible that there would be elements in the armed forces who wonder whether they and their comrades made this sacrifice only to allow Prabhakaran's photograph to be openly distributed and for him to be called a great hero in the same old battlefield. So, if the president is under that kind of pressure, and that kind of pressure can be contrived, by the way, any leader would first look at his own interests and might then feel apprehensive enough to actually shut down the provincial council. Now that would trigger the trap, unless it has been proven transparently to India and the world community that it was a legitimate reaction to some kind of provocation of sufficient magnitude on the part of the Northern Council. So I believe what is necessary after September 21st is that within Sri Lanka and outside there has to be a lot of bridge building between the provincial council and the government. Now, this is not building bridges between equal partners. These are not two nations. These are not two countries of the TNA tends to see itself as being in some kind of bilateral negotiation with the government. It's not. The provincial council is what is known as it's subunit devolution. I mean, devolution moves down from center to periphery. These are not two equal partners. But there has to be a connecting tissue. There's a lot of work to be done by civil society and by the international community, including India.
Dr. Jayatilleka, you mentioned civil society. This is another issue that I want to talk about. Is the fact that we're seeing such divisive politics in the North, could you attribute it to a failure on the part of civil society?
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. Civil society in Sri Lanka is, well, not what it used to be, because if you look at the post-independence Sri Lanka or Ceylon, right down to, say, around 1990, there was a different quality of civil society. You still see the residue of that civil society in outstanding figures who, thank God, are still alive. Justice Veerabantri, Godfrey Gunatilleka. I mean, you can just think back and figure out what they were like when they were 25 or 30 and so on. That's what civil society was like. You have nothing like that today. Neelan Tiruchelvam was the last politician who also had that kind of stature in civil society. But today, civil society it has three groupings.